Growing up, I never felt truly seen. My parents always had a special place in their hearts for my brother, Alex, and I spent my entire childhood trying to earn that same level of attention and affection. It was never explicitly said, but the favoritism was always clear. They would celebrate every little achievement of his, even the smallest accomplishments, while I was left to find my own ways to prove my worth. My brother was always the golden child. He could do no wrong in their eyes, and no matter how hard I tried, I was never enough to make them proud in the same way. I remember one of the most vivid memories from my childhood when I was about 12. It was the day I brought home my school report card, proud of the high grades I had achieved. My parents barely glanced at it. They were too busy preparing for Alex's soccer game that evening. They had forgotten it was the day my school had an award ceremony, but they never once apologized for missing it. Instead, they made me feel guilty for even bringing it up. "Don't be selfish," my father said. "You know how important Alex's game is." It was a moment that burned into my memory and stayed with me throughout the years, a reminder that I was always second. Over the years, this dynamic didn't change. It only grew more painful. As I entered adulthood, I started to feel the full weight of how emotionally manipulative my parents were. Their love, when it was offered, always came with strings attached. They'd offer praise, but only if I followed the path they dictated for me. If I veered off course, the support would disappear. I was constantly on edge, never quite sure if I was living up to their expectations or if I was just a placeholder in their eyes. Now, as an adult, the cracks in our relationship were more apparent than ever. My parents continued to support Alex, and yet when it came to my own milestones, my life, my achievements, they either dismissed or undermined them. They saw me as a convenience, something that was nice to have but never truly valued. And now, as I stood on the verge of yet another disappointing moment with them, I felt the familiar sting of rejection creeping in. Little did they know this time I was about to change everything. When my father casually dropped the news about Alex's new home, it hit me harder than I cared to admit. "Your brother deserved the new house. He actually has a family." "Your family doesn't matter at all," he said, his words cutting through the air like a sharp knife. He handed me a pair of socks, his way of telling me to move on from whatever resentment I felt. I stood there, motionless, trying to hide the storm brewing inside me. Alex, my brother, had always been the golden child. He could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, and this new house was just another sign of how much more they valued him over me. I had never questioned their favoritism outright, but today I felt the weight of it pressing down on me more than ever. The house, a symbol of my brother's success, was now another reminder of how little I mattered in their world. My parents, in their attempt to support Alex, had completely overlooked me once again, and for the first time it no longer hurt. As I stood there, taking in the quiet absurdity of it all, I realized something profound. My entire life, I had been trying to prove my worth to these people who would never fully see me. My father's callous remark about Alex having a family was the last straw. I had been playing the role of the dutiful daughter, always in the background, always second to Alex's accomplishments. The home he was getting wasn't just a physical space. It was the embodiment of everything I had missed out on. It was the reward for being their perfect child while I was left to fend for myself. I felt the knot in my stomach twist tighter. This was more than just a house. It was the epitome of years of favoritism, neglect, and emotional manipulation. I had always been content with staying in the background, trying to play nice, but now, standing there holding those socks, I realized that I didn't have to accept this anymore. A cold calmness settled over me. I was no longer that little girl trying to win their approval. In that moment, a quiet but powerful realization washed over me. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need their recognition. I needed to take control of my life, and I would do it on my terms, no longer bound by their expectations. As my father handed me the socks, I felt a surge of disbelief. The gesture was so trivial, so insignificant, yet it felt like the culmination of everything I had tried to endure. There I was, standing in the living room, my heart heavy with the weight of his words. "Your brother deserved the new home," he had said, his tone indifferent, almost dismissive. "He actually has a family. Your family doesn't matter at all." And just like that, he handed me a pair of socks, as if it was all I deserved. I stood there, frozen for a moment, as the words sank in. I had expected more, an explanation, a moment of empathy, anything that could show me that my existence mattered to them. But all I received was the cold reality of their indifference. I took the socks without a word, forcing a smile as if everything was fine. But inside, a storm raged. I wanted to shout, to scream, to demand some kind of recognition or respect. But I didn't. I stayed silent. I had spent so much of my life trying to earn their love, their approval. I would do anything to be seen, to be noticed. Yet, every time I was left disappointed. From my earliest memories, I had tried to shine in their eyes. I remember when I was just a child, writing a poem for my father's birthday, hoping it would be the one thing that would make him proud. But he didn't even read it. Instead, he brushed it aside, only to lavish praise on Alex for something as trivial as a school project. In my teenage years, I worked harder than ever, hoping that the better grades, the successful achievements would finally earn me the acknowledgement I craved. But it was always the same. Alex's accomplishments were always more important. He was the one who could do no wrong. He was the one who mattered. And now, years later, I was still the same person, silent, unnoticed, unimportant. But something had shifted inside me. As I stood there, staring at the socks in my hands, I felt a quiet strength welling up inside me. I was done. I didn't need to fight for their attention anymore. I had been seeking their approval for so long. But now I realized it wasn't worth the cost. I was worth more than the scraps they offered. It was time to stop trying to prove my value to them. I wouldn't engage in the emotional outbursts they were used to seeing from me. I would stay calm, silent, and firm. I would show them that I could thrive without their validation. And with that realization, my decision was made. As I stood there in the quiet aftermath of my father's dismissal, the weight of it all began to settle into my bones. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the anger and hurt threatening to break free. But I couldn't let it. I had spent so many years trying to fight for something that was never going to come. Their love, their respect, their recognition. It was always just out of reach, no matter how hard I tried. I had spent years sacrificing pieces of myself for them. Countless hours helping my father with his business, listening to my mother's endless complaints, putting my own dreams on hold to play the dutiful child they expected. Every time I made a sacrifice, I thought it would bring me closer to being seen, to being valued. But it never did. I always felt like a shadow in their lives, never the priority, never the focus. I thought back to those moments, the countless times I had put aside my own feelings to support them, only to be met with disappointment. I remembered the time I had sacrificed my college savings to help pay off one of their debts, only for them to brush me off when I needed their help in return. I thought of all the birthday dinners I attended alone, missing out on family gatherings and being left out of conversations because I didn't fit into their picture of the perfect family. Every effort I made to bond with them felt like I was pushing against a wall, never able to break through. The sacrifices had been so one-sided. I had given them everything I had, my time, my energy, my love, hoping it would be enough. But it wasn't. They took and took, without ever considering what I needed in return. It was always about them, always about Alex, always about their needs and expectations. And what did I get in return? A pair of socks. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. I had spent my life bending over backwards for them. And for what? A life where I was never enough. A life where my worth was measured only by what I could give. But not anymore. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly sacrificing my happiness, my self-worth, just to get scraps of affection. It was time to stop. Time to stop enabling their behavior. Time to stop giving them the power to take from me. I had always been too afraid to break free, afraid of what they might think, afraid of disappointing them. But that fear had kept me stuck in a cycle of bitterness and regret. It was time to take control of my own life. The decision came quietly, almost as if it was always there, waiting for the right moment. I wasn't going to shout or scream. I wasn't going to make a scene. I was going to act silently, decisively. I would remove my name from their utilities. They would no longer be able to use me as their financial safety net. I wasn't going to be their last resort anymore. If they wanted help, they would have to find it elsewhere. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about hurting them. It was about finally setting a boundary, a line in the sand that I was no longer willing to let them cross. I had spent my entire life trying to prove myself to them, but I was done. This would be my quiet declaration of independence. As I made the decision, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I felt empowered. Not by loud words, not by a dramatic confrontation, but by my quiet strength, my ability to walk away from the chains that had held me for so long. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about reclaiming my life. And that was all that mattered now. The air in the room felt thick with tension as my father's words hung in the space between us. "Your brother deserved the new home," he said, almost dismissively, as he continued sorting through his papers. "He actually has family. Your family doesn't matter at all." I stood there, the weight of his words pressing against my chest, but I didn't flinch. I had been hearing these things for years, the way my parents had always placed Alex on a pedestal, praised him for things I had worked so hard for, and let me slip into the shadows. The truth wasn't new. It was just the rawness of it, the utter finality in his voice that stung. My father turned, oblivious to the hurt he had just caused, and handed me a pair of socks. His usual way of helping, when he couldn't be bothered to offer anything real. He expected a thank you or some kind of expression of gratitude, but all I could feel was the emptiness that had grown inside me over the years. They had always seen me as someone who would accept whatever they handed me, no matter how little or meaningless it was. And I had always played along until now. My heart raced as the words formed in my mind, but I kept my face calm, the mask firmly in place. I wasn't going to let him see the hurt, not this time. I wasn't going to beg for validation or approval. I had done that for too long. I knew now that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be the child they wanted me to be, the child who could please them, make them proud. I would never be good enough in their eyes. But something inside me snapped. As the realization settled, my composure shifted. I looked him in the eye, my voice steady but firm. "Okay, just don't ask me for money for your bills anymore," I said, my words simple but powerful. "You've got Alex now. Let him take care of it." There was a brief, stunned silence. My father raised an eyebrow, as if he couldn't quite comprehend what I had just said. He laughed, almost dismissively, assuming that I was bluffing, that I would never go through with it. "What are you talking about?" he asked with a half smirk. "Your brother doesn't need to pay the bills. You've always been the one to help us out." I didn't respond right away. I could feel the surge of emotions pushing against the calm front I had carefully constructed, but I held it together. I didn't need to argue, didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to shout or cry or plead. I had already made up my mind. My decision was made, and it wasn't just words anymore. It was action, and I would follow through. It wasn't about getting revenge. It was about putting an end to the cycle. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my strength, my autonomy. It was about showing them once and for all that I would no longer be their fallback, their financial crutch, their punching bag. They had treated me like an afterthought, and I had accepted it for far too long. But no more. I watched my father's face, trying to gauge his reaction, but he seemed almost dismissive, his confidence unshaken. He thought I was bluffing, just like always. He laughed again, this time a little more nervously, but I didn't flinch. I stood there, knowing that this was the moment. I was letting go, silently but decisively. I had made my decision. I had drawn my line in the sand, and this time they wouldn't cross it. It took everything in me not to break down in that moment. The years of silence, the years of being disregarded, the years of emotional neglect, they all came rushing to the surface. But I didn't let it show. I was stronger now, stronger than I had ever been before. I wasn't going to let them see me break. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing my pain. They had pushed me too far, and I had finally reached my limit. As I turned away, I felt the weight of the decision settling in. It was painful, yes, but it was also freeing. The silence of my response said everything I needed to say. I wasn't going to beg for their love anymore. I wasn't going to play their games. I was going to stand on my own, and I was going to do it quietly with dignity. The emotional toll was immense, but in that moment, I felt a small seed of peace. I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing it for me. And that was all that mattered now. The days that followed were strangely quiet. It felt almost like waiting for a storm to pass, the kind of quiet before everything changes. I spent my time thinking, reflecting, planning. My decision to cut off my financial ties with my parents was already made. I had removed my name from the utilities, the accounts that had always tethered me to them. It wasn't just about the money, it was about making a statement. I wasn't going to be the one they relied on anymore. They had always assumed that I'd be there, ready to pay the bills, to step in when things got difficult. But not this time. This time, I was going to let them feel what it was like to have the ground pulled out from under them, to have the reality of their dependence on me set in. The mail arrived just as it always did, routine, predictable. But this time there was a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. I didn't open the mailbox myself. I knew that would come later, when they would finally notice, when they would start to realize that things weren't right. And then it happened. It was a Saturday morning when I heard the first sounds of confusion from inside the house. I was sitting in my room, quietly sipping my coffee, pretending I didn't hear the rising tension outside. My father's voice, always so authoritative, suddenly faltered. "Where's the bill for the electricity?" he called to my mother. "I'm sure it came today." There was a pause, a slight shift in the rhythm of the house. My mother's voice followed, sharper than usual. "It should be here, but I don't see it." The silence stretched, and then I heard my father's footsteps heading towards the front door. I knew exactly what was happening. He was checking the mailbox. I sat there, calm and still, as the moments dragged on. The minutes felt like hours. My heart pounded, but not out of fear or anxiety. It was satisfaction, a quiet, unspoken satisfaction. The satisfaction of knowing I had finally taken control of the situation. I had set the wheels in motion, and now they were starting to turn. "Something's wrong," my father said, his voice growing louder as he returned to the living room. "The utilities bill, it's not here. And it's not in my name anymore." I could hear the panic in his voice now, the confusion as the reality began to sink in. He called my mother again, his words almost frantic, but she didn't have an answer. "That's impossible," she said, her voice wavering. "It should be on the system." I remained in my room, unmoved by their increasing panic. It wasn't like I was expecting them to understand right away, but hearing the realization dawn on them, hearing the shock in their voices, was its own kind of power. I had taken control without a single shout, without a single confrontation. No accusations, no angry words. Just silence. And that silence had spoken louder than anything else could have. The next few hours were a blur of the frantic attempts to call the utility companies, trying to get answers, scrambling to figure out what had happened. But it didn't matter. The deed was done. There was no turning back. And as I sat there, listening to their panic unfold, I felt a quiet sense of victory. It wasn't a victory won through anger or revenge. It wasn't even about them, not really. It was about me, about reclaiming my power, about no longer letting them manipulate me or control my life. They would never know how much it had cost me to reach this point, how much I had suffered silently over the years. But now they would feel the consequences of their actions, and I would walk away, silently, knowing that I had finally taken control. No words needed to be said. The silence spoke for itself. The following days were filled with frantic calls from my parents, none of which I answered. I could hear the desperation in their voices through the voicemail messages they left, pleas for help, for explanations, for me to just come back and fix it. My father's usually steady voice was now unrecognizable, cracked with frustration. He didn't understand. He couldn't. My mother's tone was even more pleading, trying to appeal to my guilt, reminding me of everything she had done for me, every little thing she had given me, the sacrifices she had made. But her words, once so powerful, now fell hollow, as if she too knew that it was too late. The power dynamic had shifted, and I wasn't coming back to fix things for them anymore. I didn't feel anger. In fact, I wasn't even particularly upset. All I felt was a deep, quiet sense of calm. I had no intention of running back to their rescue. I was no longer their safety net, their emotional crutch, or their ATM. I had done what I had needed to do for myself, and now I was standing firmly in my own independence. I was free, but as I watched them scramble, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice in the situation. For years, I had been their quiet enabler, letting them lean on me, taking on their burdens, cleaning up their messes, all while they treated me as less than. But now they were facing the consequences of their own actions. They had no choice but to confront their dependency, and it was a hard pill to swallow. It was strange to witness their panic, especially after all the times they had disregarded my feelings, minimized my needs, and invalidated my existence. Now they were the ones feeling vulnerable, helpless, and exposed. I had been so used to this pattern of imbalance, always giving, never receiving, but now the scales had tipped, and it was them who had to confront their own shortcomings. I had always thought that cutting them off would bring me a sense of revenge or relief, but it wasn't like that at all. There was no bitterness or resentment in my heart. Instead, there was a growing sense of pride, a quiet pride that came from knowing I had taken control of my own life. I wasn't defined by their expectations anymore, nor by their toxic influence. For the first time, I was standing alone, and it felt empowering. There was a small part of me that knew I could have told them everything. The reasons behind my actions, the pain I had endured, the years I had wasted hoping for love and respect that would never come. But I didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. I had done what was necessary for my own peace, and they would have to figure things out on their own now. As I reflected on all that had happened, I realized how much I had grown. I had found strength in my silence, in my ability to detach from a family that had never truly seen me for who I was. I had discovered my own worth, not through their validation, but through my own actions. And now, as I watched them face the fallout, I knew that this was the beginning of something new. I had chosen self-sufficiency over dependence, independence over obligation, and that was the most powerful choice I could have made. I was free, and for the first time in my life, I was at peace. The days that followed were quieter than I had expected. The phone calls, the desperate attempts to get me back into their web of manipulation, dwindled away. My parents' panic became more of a distant noise, something I could almost ignore entirely. I had turned away from their chaotic demands, choosing instead to focus on the steady rhythm of my life, one that no longer included the heavy burden of their expectations. As I sat in my living room, sipping a cup of tea, I thought back on the person I had been before all of this. The person who had always tried to please, always tried to fix things, always sought validation from people who had never truly cared. I had spent so much of my life caught in a cycle of giving and hoping for love in return, only to be met with dismissal, selfishness, and indifference. I had been living in their shadow, bending over backward to be someone they could accept. But now I was free. And the beauty of it wasn't in the moment of revenge, in the removal of my name from their bills, or in watching them scramble. No, the peace I felt wasn't born from the harm I had caused them. It was born from the quiet strength I had discovered within myself, from the realization that I no longer needed their approval, their love, or their acceptance to define who I was. Looking at myself in the mirror one morning, I saw the change. There was no longer the fragile hope in my eyes that once believed family could offer unconditional love. I had stopped seeking it. Instead, what I saw was a woman who had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, a woman who had learned to protect her own peace, even if it meant walking away from people she once thought she could never live without. My parents were facing the consequences of their selfishness now. Without my financial support, they were scrambling to figure out how to keep up with their bills, their lifestyle, the things they had relied on me to handle for years. It wasn't easy for them, and I wasn't blind to their struggle. But I wasn't responsible for their choices anymore, and that realization brought me peace. They were adults who had made their own decisions, and now it was time for them to face the results of those decisions. I didn't need to say anything to them anymore. They had heard everything they needed to hear in the silence I had given them. And now I walked away with dignity, no more fights, no more desperate pleas for my attention. I didn't owe them anything, and I wasn't going to feel guilty for finally taking control of my own life. The final moment of peace came one evening when I sat on my porch watching the sunset. The sky was a soft blend of orange and pink, and the air was calm. For the first time in years, I felt like I had finally exhaled. No longer tethered to a family that had drained me, I was free. The weight had lifted, and what replaced it was a sense of self-worth that no one could take away from me. As the day faded into night, I closed my eyes, letting the stillness wash over me. The final chapter of that chapter in my life had been written, and I was proud of the person I had become. I no longer needed anything from them, except perhaps the lesson they had taught me, that sometimes The most powerful thing you can do is walk away with grace and strength and let time reveal the truth. And that's exactly what I did.